It said it's not recording. Everybody, I might have to log in and off for a sec. It says it's not working. Yeah, I hit record and I got a big thing saying it cannot record.
It's saying the recording.
Everyone give me a sec.
It said it just started, so
Yeah,
it should be recording now.
Says it's recording on my screen.
Huh. Okay, now it says it's on mine too. But I got a message on mine saying it's not recording. So, oh well, missed a couple things. Back to this. Watergate. So what Nixon did is Nixon covered it up by saying it was part of an FBI CIA operation because of national security. But Nixon was wiretapping his Oval Office conversations. And after he won a huge landslide victory, the Republican Nixon beat the Democrat McGovern in 72, a massive landslide, it started to come out. And the tapes came out, and Nixon tried his best to cover it up. And so did most of his allies within the Republican Party. But eventually, in the summer of 1974, the Supreme Court ruled he had to release the tapes, and it clearly showed that he was covering up a robbery. We don't know if he was directly involved, but this is, so Nixon would resign before he was impeached. And that's why every scandal is going to have Watergate on it. Next one down, let's talk a little bit more about the election of 68. And that's another one I didn't get to full detail, so let's talk very quickly about that one. And the election of 68, Lyndon Johnson dropped out of the election after the Tet Offensive and decided not to run. And LBJ won the biggest popular vote landslide in history back in 64. That shows you how divisive the Vietnam War was. So he dropped out, and he dropped out of the election. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, would run for the Democrats, but it looked like he wasn't going to win. The Republicans ran Nixon again. Remember, we just mentioned Nixon, but Nixon lost in 1960. And Nixon had a secret plan to get out of the Vietnam War. But for the most part, Nixon played on the social issue, implying that the Democrats were divisive with civil rights, women's rights, and the anti-war movement. And he would bring the country back together, which is ironic because it was a Democrat that got into the war. And then the Democrats were split because the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, jumped into the race too as another states' rights candidate like 1948. And it looked like Nixon would win. But Humphrey came out against the war, but it was too late. And Nixon won a razor-thin victory. And part of the reason Nixon would win is what's called the Southern strategy, where Nixon would employ, they called it law and order, but it was clearly a race-based, anti-war-based campaign to appeal to Southern whites. And so basically, he came out against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and said he would bring law and order. And that would be called the Southern strategy, which would be a remarkably successful strategy by Republicans. Its first time was tried in 64, but 68. And today, that's why I've mentioned before, the Republican Party really is a Southern party. So a big flop. Shu had one more thing about 68. There was a chance for a peace agreement, a Paris peace agreement. It looked like it might happen. But Nixon scuttled the peace agreement, South Vietnam, but scuttled it right before the election, saying he would give the South a better deal, so the war would last for 4 more years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next one down. We mentioned Keynesian, Watergate, nullification. Nullification of 1832. I feel like I've talked about this one a few times. So the nullification issue, that's where they states that they can nullify a law, which, by the way, if a state can nullify a law, it's over. James Madison said, next stop, dictatorship. But anyways, if you know anything about state politics, you know what I'm talking about. But I lost it. What page is on again? Page 4. So nullification right in the middle. And just very quickly about that one was Southerners want to nullify the tariff because there was a huge tariff, the tariff of abominations in 1828. And when it was cut in 1832, it wasn't enough for Southerners because this was John C. Calhoun's plan to nullify the tariff, not just to get rid of the tariff, because it did not help the South directly. But the big reason, and this is what you got to get down, is to nullify the tariff because he wanted to find an issue that would unify all the South, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or Whigs, unify the South against slavery, or unify the South to protect slavery. Sorry, I'm looking at the screen, looking at things pop up. Unify the South to protect slavery. So South Carolina nullified the tariff of 1832. This is right after the election in 1833. Andrew Jackson reacted with fury, saying he will personally lead the army down, and they would pass the force bill to say the federal government will enforce laws. This scared the rest of the South, so South Carolina was alone. And eventually, South Carolina would have to accept a compromise tariff that would slowly lower it, first proposed by Jackson, but by Henry Clay, the great compromiser. And this was a huge deal, because if Jackson would not have reacted with fury and the rest of the South joined in, the United States as we know it would be done. There's no way the United States could have won the Civil War if the Civil War would happen in 1833. So Jackson arguably saved the Union for a while at least, and it did save. It did last at least, we survived the Civil War, and the Union, as far as I know, is still there, shaky as it might be sometime. And I've also think I've mentioned this one too, executive War. Yeah, Executive Order 9906 on page 9. So I've said this once before in the review section, I'll say it very quickly. That was the order by Roosevelt to intern Japanese Americans, citizens or legal residents, but the legal citizens along the West Coast in April of 1942 as a wartime measure. Korematsu versus U.S. said, yes, the president could do this as a wartime measure. So this shows how war madness, but also greed to still Japanese-owned farms and businesses, could happen in the United States. The U.S. set up concentration camps and even drafted young men out of these internment camps and sent them to war. Long hot summers and Watts. So this is one, I got a couple of people about this one, and I didn't get a chance to talk about it. So thank you for asking this, Reed. Well done. Wow, Reed. Now, see, we've had very good questions so far. Actually, I really want to make sure I got to this. This is in the very, fifth of the way down, page 11 on the right-hand side. Long hot summers. And what happened was, after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act happened, the reality of the economic inequalities of northern cities, we talked about redlining and also job discrimination and sundown towns, that still remained. And in the summer of 1965, a series of riots, we've already mentioned these before, a similar thing happened in Red Summer 1919 and in 1943. And they're going to be called race riots, even though that's, it's much more complex than that. But they started calling them long hot summers, because in the hot summers, there would begin to be protests. Almost all of them, including ones in Newark, New York, Detroit, Chicago, and the one in Watts, which is in Los Angeles, which would be one of the bloodiest ones in 1967, would all start by instances of police violence against African-American men. And so people think what's happening now and think, well, God, this is so weird. How could this happen? It happened all the time. This was an event, as I mentioned before, but I'm saying it again. And these massive protests, and these would turn into violent series of rage and attacks, and National Guard would call out in Detroit, and Watts, Johnson would call out the 82nd Airborne Division. And this would convince a lot of whites. Remember, I talked about this before, but there was a lot of backlash against the civil rights movement. This would help trigger the conservative backlash. Look down the bottom. This is another thing, so put another arrow. And this was an example to many whites, suburban whites especially, and it fit in with the Southern strategy. Look what happens when you give people like that rights. They just burn down their neighborhoods. Now, there's no, you can make an argument about whatever the right reaction to do against police violence and inequalities, but this would be used as a backlash. Next one down. so long odd numbers, that's another name for the, and this will go on 66 all the way to 70. The biggest example of this would be after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it was like a fury on the streets. It's page 7, Alice Paul and the 19th Amendment. Another good one. And that's one that I have not done in a review session. I'm really glad that one was answered too, because it's such an important thing. This is where Alice Paul, this is the fight for voting rights in the United States. Remember, this goes all the way back to Seneca Falls, back in 1848. This continuous fight. And Alice Paul broke away from Main Street suffragette movements, and she, following the British model, demanded direct action. During the war, she demanded that Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats, the progressive Democrats, and some progressive Republicans do what they promised and do voting rights. Well, they said, wait till the war is over. And so they protested and were arrested under the Espionage Act. Alice Paul was force-fed. Remember, I talked about that. But this forced, they made the Democrats who controlled Congress, along with progressive Republicans, pass the 19th Amendment out of Congress, and then eventually the 3/4 of the state, lastly Tennessee, finally voted to get the 19th Amendment, called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and women got the right to vote. But remember, some states already had that. Montana had that back in 1914. We talked about Jeanette Rankin in class. Alice Paul then went on to the Equal Rights Amendment. And she first proposed that to try to get to Congress. It never passed in Congress up until the 1970s, where Democrats pushed it through. And that's page 11. I talked about that a little bit in class today, the Equal Rights Amendment. But that said no discrimination based upon sex, and that's on page 11. But that was never ratified. And so to this day, women are not guaranteed equal rights under the Constitution. And I guarantee you, as I said in class, it would never pass today. The oil embargo on page 11. Montana has that in its Constitution. And I think I mentioned this in class too. But I guarantee you, Montana's House and Senate would not vote for it today, even though it's in the Constitution. Page 11. I'm looking for the oil embargo. I'm still looking. Oh, there it is. About 2/3 of the way down, stagflation in the oil embargo. So let me explain what happened in the 1970s. What happened was inflation was going up. Normally inflation happens when there's high demand and a booming economy. The 60s, 50s and 60s were the best economic time in history. And it's just a totally different world than what we have today. I should have people, I've mentioned this in class before, people my age, we grew up in that. And that's what we still think the world is, a lot of people my age. And it's a lot different now. But the stagflation. So what happened in the 1970s, though, things reversed. And it happened that shouldn't happen normally in Keynesian economics. 2 different times. 1974, after the United States supported Israel in the Arab-Israeli war, it's called the Yom Kippur War. So we supported Israel. In 74, Middle Eastern countries, the OPEC nations, embargoed oil to the West, including the United States. In 74, and the same thing happened in 79 when the hostage crisis with Iran, which I mentioned the other day. And these, both times, 74 and 79, oil prices went up, crude oil prices, 400%. Literally overnight, prices skyrocketed. And then the prices for everything went up dramatically. And so what happened was you have prices going up, shortages, and this helped trigger a recession in 74 and 79 with high inflation. That shouldn't happen. And so they called that stagflation. Nobody really knew what to do. And even though the economy of the 70s was actually overall, as this broad-based economy, better than today, it seemed worse because there was inflation as high as 15 or 20% annually. You have never seen that in your life. 2% is high right now. It's like, oh my gosh. And put an arrow. This directly led to help lead to conservative backlash. This stagflation. People all of a sudden they were paying 40 cents a gallon of gas and all of a sudden paying $1.60. And who do they blame? The president. The president was a Democrat. Yeah, and Carter in out. Yeah, that's another story. Another one. Where are we at here? Conservative backlash, moral majority. So I've told you about 50 different things about the conservative backlash. So I keep telling you about this conservative backlash. So I've talked about all they said, put an arrow. But this was a backlash against the social changes, very much like the 1920s. All the changes that came out of the progressive era and the women's rights movement and the desire to go back to normal. But the moral majority, evangelical Christians, which is a huge percentage of especially the South, but all over the United States, a huge percentage, no, I mean huge, people consider some evangelicals anywhere from, depends on how they rate it, 15 to 30% of the population of the South. But that's a big block. They were never partisan. They voted Republican or Democrat. In fact, they overwhelmingly voted for Jimmy Carter because he was a evangelical Christian in 1976. But after 76, evangelical Christians, one of the groups was called the moral majority, would become in a way the religious right. And they would begin voting as a bloc for Republicans on these cultural or social issues like against the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion rights and women's rights. Against, as they saw, the excesses of the civil rights movement, against the changing culture because of things like, as we mentioned today in class, the pill. And this was part of the Southern strategy, but was masterfully handled by Republican candidates, especially Ronald Reagan, and ineptly handled by Democrats. It would lead to Republican presidents and then eventually even Republican majority in states, which took a long time to get. Silent majority. So let's go about a third of the way down on page 11. And so the silent majority, that is what Nixon called the great silent majority in 1970. People who aren't protesting, out there demanding rights. They're hardworking people. They're the ones who are out there that are drafted and fighting in the war, and they're not protesting the war. And this was a great cultural argument that fit in with the silent majority. The working people are at home. And I got to be very clear about it. This meant the white working people, white working class that weren't the ones protesting. And this was an effective argument. It gave the Republicans their first big inroad into union voters that were always Democratic. Ironically, the conservative backlash will be part of getting rid of unions, but that's another story. A little bit further down, détente. I mentioned that in class, maybe only in 2 periods, but let me do this very quickly. Détente on the left. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon was able to lessen tensions with the Soviet Union. And they would pass the first arms limitation agreement called SALT, to limit arms. And actually, this would be bitterly attacked in the conservative backlash, even though Ronald Reagan supported him. Ronald Reagan would attack this. But also détente, if you look across there, Nixon, realizing that the Soviet Union and China weren't actually close friends, they actually went into 2 pitched battles on the Manchurian-Siberian border. Nixon actually would go to Paris. Did I say Paris? Beijing, slightly different town, and open up negotiations with China, the People's Republic of China. And that would eventually lead to, is what I told you before, in 1979, where the U.S. closed their embassy in Taiwan, and we technically don't recognize that, and open up the embassy in Beijing, and they now have that seat in the UN. Next one down, Silent Spring. Oh, that one, I didn't, thank you for asking that. Silent Spring. So Silent Springs, in many ways, would trigger the modern environmental movement. And this was a book by Rachel Carson back in 1961. And she wrote about a number of environmental factors that were killing birds, thus the Silent Spring, no birds chirping. But the big thing was a pesticide, what was considered a wonder pesticide called DDT. And DDT was not only a carcinogenic pesticide for men, or for humans, but they were also, it was, this pesticide would degrade eggs, and basically eggs would dissolve and kill birds, especially bigger birds. That's why the California condor nearly went extinct because of this, and they've never really come back. And there are a few, this is one of the regulations. Every once in a while they talk about bringing back DDT, but this would be the modern environmental movement would come out of this and would have great effect. DDT would be banned eventually by by the United States government as part of the Great Society, and eventually this would lead to the EPA. And I should add that they just found about 500 barrels of DDT that they just dropped off the shore of California, and it's leaking slowly. And yeah, just literally 4 days ago. Next one down, Cambodia, Kent, and Jackson State. And so this is one I did not get a chance to talk about this. And so, oh, did I skip one? I'm going to skip one and come back to that. So let's go down to Tyler. Yeah, so Joshua, I'm going to skip that one and go down to Tyler's. Tyler asked about Vietnamization. And Vietnamization was a way that Richard Nixon, when he was elected, was going to turn over the war to the South Vietnamese. And by turning the war over to the South Vietnamese, the idea was the U.S. could start pulling its troops out, thus alleviate the threat of the anti-war movement after the Vietnam War moratorium in '69, this massive million-person anti-war protest. Nixon was terrified about them voting against him in '72. So this would lessen it, and it worked for a few years. South Vietnam had an advantage because the Viet Cong was absolutely destroyed in their massive offensive called Tet, which might have destroyed LBJ's presidency, but the Viet Cong was decimated as a force, so gave a little breathing space for this. So that's Vietnamization. In fact, let me add one more thing right there. We didn't talk about, I just mentioned the draft. Well, the draft during LBJ's term was very unfair. Draft boards would locally just draft individuals, whoever they wanted to draft. And sometimes this could be anybody from age 18 to 38. And so, for example, the most famous person was the Memphis draft board was mad at the heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali. So they just drafted him. And he would become a conscientious objector and lose his title. But they drafted him partially because he converted to Islam. And also they didn't like the fact that he was very vocal in his opposition to the war and also vocal against Jim Crow laws. Well, in 1969, the draft changed to a lottery where they just would randomly pick birth dates and give them a number, and they would only pick a certain amount. So if your number wasn't picked, you weren't drafted. And this alleviated a lot of the pressure of the draft. Now it wasn't just this random thing. If you didn't get called, you're out. And so the draft also began to be limited. If they started the draft again, that's what would happen. Well, Nixon appeared to be pulling back. Now let's go back up to Cambodia. But in 1970, the United States and South Vietnam, when Nixon said we're pulling out, invaded Cambodia. And the thought of invasion of Cambodia was to cut off the Viet Cong supply lines. It failed miserably. But many people believed that Nixon's actually escalating the war. And there were anti-war protests all over, including at Kent State in Ohio. And the protests had died down, but the National Guard was called out. And on May 4th, 1970, so a few days after Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, things were relatively peaceful, but National Guardsmen panicked and fired into a group of students who were literally just crossing the commons between classes and go to lunch. And 4 students were killed and over 20 were wounded. And this horrible attack on not even protesters, but on the protest would become this divisive issue between the pro-war and the anti-war, with a lot of the pro-war people saying they deserve to die. There was also a massive anti-war protest at Jackson State. And at this, over 44 people would be wounded by state police and National Guard in Mississippi. But everybody talked about Kent State. Nobody talked about Jackson State, because Jackson State was a traditionally all-black college. And next one down. All right. I just mentioned this a couple times in class, so let me get to this very quickly. I did talk about this, but I was not clear, so it's kind of oblique, so I'm glad that, oh no, am I skipping one? Let's go to Aiden's first, LBJ and the Great Society. So I just mentioned this, but Lyndon Johnson, who took over after Kennedy was assassinated, was going to finish the new frontier. In fact, the Great Society was going to be Johnson's great program to finish the New Deal. And there would be over 1,000 laws passed in the Great Society. Nobody ever passed laws like Lyndon Johnson. You've never seen anything like it, but it was 3 main prongs. Number one, civil rights. And the two big laws are on the other page that would be passed, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Number two, so Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, but it was civil rights. Number two was a war on poverty. And this was a less coordinated idea to put out as many programs as possible, from direct aid, things like food stamps, and also aid to families with dependent children, which is gone now, but also job training and things like Pell Grants and guaranteed student loans to help people go to college. But this is going to be part of what's called a war on poverty. And the war on poverty at first had initially great success. Poverty dropped by 2/3. But Nixon would, and the Nixon administration, most of these programs would be cut back. And there were some big flaws on this. LBJ just tried to pass laws, thinking we'll improve them later, but Vietnam got in the way. And the last one was cultural growth. Not massive aid, but aid for things like the creation of public television, which now government very hardly funds at all, but also like National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, parks, things like that. So we had this grand program, and a lot of it passed, but then the Vietnam War got in the way. And he couldn't get it. He got a lot passed by 65. You can make your own argument whether good or bad. If you get any college aid or any educational aid, anything from the federal government, that's all Lyndon Johnson. So that was his goal. That's all he cared about. He could care less about Vietnam, but he's stuck with Vietnam. John Kennedy made Vietnam very important. John Kennedy stuck with it because Kennedy wanted to defend Berlin, the domino theory. Kennedy wanted to show that he's tough on communism, and then Kennedy died. And so LBJ's reasons to stay in the war, if you look about a quarter of the way down on the left, LBJ's reason was Kennedy's legacy. John Kennedy made it important, and LBJ didn't want Kennedy's brother Robert Kennedy to out there saying, LBJ failed my brother, I'm jumping in the presidential race, which he would do in 68 and be assassinated like his brother. And so that's the first reason. The other one is he wanted to show he's credible. If we're going to say we'll defend Berlin, then we must be credible and defend our ally in South Vietnam. And Johnson saw things as very black and white that way. Another big reason, and this one you have to underline and put stars by it, he wanted the Great Society passed. The Great Society programs he thought would never pass if we lost in Vietnam. And so he thought, I must show I'm tough in Vietnam. And so he would commit troops in 1965, the biggest reason, the Great Society. Ironically, he tried to also keep the cost secret because it might hurt the Great Society. And what would the Vietnam War do? Destroy his presidency and the Great Society. So in many ways, this is like one of those Greek tragedies. And if you look right across from there, LBJ's reason, and the credibility gap, he said we're credibility to show we're credible. Well, all his lies started coming out about the reason the United States got into the war. And producing this started saying that LBJ, which LBJ kind of was a liar, and this would lead to, you can't trust him, a credibility gap. And so if you look up to Selma March and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so everyone look up that. So we're just going to do that right now. That's the top of page 11. I mentioned this in class. I mentioned it just a few seconds ago, but let me make sure I get this. The Civil Rights Act of 64, for the most part, bans discrimination based upon race or sex. And remember, I did say this in class, they added sex in there because they never thought men would vote for saying that you couldn't discriminate against women, and yet LBJ signed the bill. And the guy who pushed it through the Senate was Mike Mansfield of Montana. That passed, but it didn't address voting rights. So after Johnson won this massive landslide victory in 64, the civil rights movement, the movement, demanded Johnson act on voting rights. He said, give me time, I just got the Civil Rights Act passed. Well, they pushed him, and they triggered a march in Selma, Alabama, towards Birmingham. Alabama was basically the headquarters of segregation. That's where George Wallace was from. They were attacked by a mob and the state police, which we call Montana the Highway Patrol. They were attacked and brutalized, and dogs and fire hoses were sticked on them, or were sticked on them. Try this. This is something weird on my screen. So Johnson now had no choice to act. And so Johnson went to Congress and said, I demand a Voting Rights Act. So they pushed Johnson. Protest work. They pushed Johnson. And that's why leaders hate protests. They despise them because they work. So Johnson did it. And there was a second Selma March, this time protected by federal marshals. But at the very same time, South Vietnam is falling apart. And so Johnson decides, if I'm going to get this Voting Rights Act passed, and I'm going to get my other laws passed, like the Great Society laws, I'm going to have to commit troops. So the exact same time that the Voting Rights Act finally made it through the Senate and Johnson could sign it, Johnson announced he is committing troops under the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in Vietnam. So he could thought, okay, I committed in Vietnam, showed I'm tough on communism. I got the Voting Rights Act passed. I got Medicare and Medicaid, which is at the top of that sheet, passed. And that's the connection. Next one. That was a lot. By the way, how many we've covered? This is pretty good. I've covered a lot. I hope you're writing a lot down. Wage slavery, page 4. Let's go back in time. Wage slavery. And bottom of page 4. Wage slavery was a reaction against capitalism and the wage system. And these were people who felt left out of the system. As they saw only a few people control the capital, they get the profit, and they're stuck with the wages, yet wages are no longer tied to how hard you work, and profit all goes to the capitalist. And so they didn't feel they had any freedom or any way up. They felt that they were wages to the capitalist system. So they felt left out. And so these were people who thought capitalism was leaving them behind. And so this was a little bit different than free labor. But two things about this. So they would, many of them would become Jacksonian Democrats. And so the Democratic Party, especially Northern Democrats, these were the working people who were fearful of wage slavery but hated the expansion of slavery. But Southerners would later use that to defend slavery, saying the North are nothing but wage slaves. We treat our slaves better. The next one, Kansas-Nebraska Act, page 5. Kansas-Nebraska Act, page 5. It's right in the middle on the left. And where we at here? Okay. So this was Stephen Douglas, the guy who broke up the Compromise of 1850 to allow it to pass. He pushed for this law so he could get a transcontinental railroad. But in dealing it, he basically made a deal with Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs. So we got the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, but this threw out the Missouri Compromise, which said no slavery north of 3630. Threw that out for Kansas and Nebraska territory and said these territories will be popular sovereignty. And this was a disaster. It did two big things. First off, it led to bleeding Kansas, which I've talked about before in a couple different review sessions. That civil war in Kansas between free soil and pro-slavery border ruffians, and would lead to the creation of the Republican Party, as many Northern Whigs and free soil Democrats became the Republican Party, only a Northern party. And so you can see this as once this happened, the Civil War has a terrible inevitability. Page 7. So I did talk about W.B. Du Bois in the review session, but I thought I'd talk about Booker T. Washington too. But Booker T. Washington was a former slave, and he represented a movement that was done at a place called the Atlanta Conference, sometimes the Atlanta Manifesto. But in Atlanta, he laid out this idea that African Americans should accept second-class citizen Jim Crow laws and just demand better economic rights. and he would be more palatable for working or for white progressives. He'd be the one invited to see Teddy Roosevelt, not W.B. Du Bois. The Clayton Antitrust Act, that would be the strengthening of the Sherman Antitrust Act under President Wilson. And so Wilson, who believed that trusts must be broke up, it's still a law today, but it strengthened it. But the Antitrust Act, Sherman Antitrust Act, is still a very weak law to break up monopolies. The election of 1912, one of the most amazing elections in history. William Howard Taft would run again, but Roosevelt was furious at him over conservation, and as he saw it ruin his legacy, Roosevelt would jump in with the Bull Moose campaign. And Roosevelt's program was new nationalism, and so this is very much like a square deal, the progressive reforms, but he thought some monopolies were good if they're efficient. Break up the bad ones. Woodrow Wilson would run, and his slogan would be, got up a slogan now, would be New Freedom. His progressive reform ideas would be very close to Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism, but he thought monopolies should be broken up, as I just said. Also, Debs, the socialist, ran. And with the Republican split, Woodrow Wilson would be elected president, the first Democrat since 1892. But it also showed how progressive the U.S. was. Where a socialist got over almost 1 million votes, and then the biggest vote getters in the election were also Wilson and Roosevelt. Let's get to where are we at here? Am I missing something? Oh, so I'll very quickly do the Pullman Strike. The Pullman Strike, which is on page 7, that's in 1894. That was there was a strike at the Pullman Railway Carriage Company cut wages for the workers during the Panic of 1893. They went on strike, and the American Railway Union under Eugene Debs joined the strike and turned into a nationwide strike. The Cleveland administration, remember he was the only Democrat elected pretty much between Buchanan and Wilson. He was very anti-union, and they started putting mail cars on trains and then saying, well, that's a constitutional duty. They got an injunction to stop the strike, which turned into a massive fight. The strike was put down brutally by the Cleveland administration. Now they called out federal troops, and Debs would become a socialist, but it also showed the country seemed to be falling apart. Coxey's army, that was also there. That was an effort by Jacob Coxey during the Panic of 1893. They thought they could march on Washington, D.C. and demand government-funded jobs, what we'd call remember the Great Depression, public works. People from all over the country went, and it passed in the House but failed in the Senate, and they would arrest him for walking on the grass, a political prisoner. And it died down, but it also shows you how desperate people were, but it appeared like the country was on the verge of revolution. Next, Carter, liberalism and decline. And so Jimmy Carter on page 11, he would be elected president. Where are we at here? So Carter be elected president in 1976, and he ran as a Democrat, but he really ran against the old Keynesian Roosevelt liberal tradition. He ran as not really much of a friend of labor unions, kind of ran against the federal government, which did so much during the Keynesian economic period, whether you like that or not, but that was really very much behind it. He ran against that and seemed to show that the liberal order was in decline by running against labor unions, running against the kind of the meat of the party, which showed that the liberal kind of or era of FDR died rather quickly under the Carter administration. Carter was much more economically conservative. He, to stop the inflation of '79, they dramatically cut back on spending, which made promoted high interest rates by the Federal Reserve, which led to a horrible economic recession. And he also restarted the Cold War in a way and began the arms buildup. Next one down, Dartmouth versus Woodward. So those are a couple cases. And I'll just tell you that really quick. That's on page 4. Why do I say it like that? Marshall Court. So just very quickly, Dartmouth versus Woodward guarantees the sanctity of contracts. Contracts are guaranteed in the Constitution, and this would be a major, you can imagine how important contracts are for capitalism. And since contracts are always written between two entities, one with power and one without, this means that those with power, aka those with the capital, will have a benefit. This would be a big boom for the market revolution, but also you see this would be a problem for inequalities down the road. Gibbons versus Ogden, that would be another Marshall Court decision, and that would protect the idea that the government can regulate interstate commerce. It says it in the Constitution, but by regulating interstate commerce, that would lead to every law from the Interstate Commerce Commission to the minimum wage, the Fair Labor Standards Act, minimum wage law, 40-hour work week, and all the environmental laws. I feel like I've answered Bleeding Kansas like twice, but Bleeding Kansas came out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that was a civil war between the pro-slavery Border Ruffians and the anti-slavery Free Soilers. And this really was a precursor to the Civil War. This is where John Brown would become famous for attacking border ruffians, he thought were border ruffians, at Pottawatomie Creek. And eventually a free soil constitution would be written in Kansas, the Topeka Constitution. But this would be kind of a precursor to the Civil War. And that came directly out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Sunbelt and demographic changes. And so beginning in the 1960s, but especially in the 1970s, that is at the very bottom of page 11, the country went through huge demographic changes. Population movements happened. And it's a twofold population shift. First off, a significant number of people began moving south, partially because companies began to move south because the South was anti-union, so they could pay their workers less. Then all those companies would move to Mexico, Guatemala, Vietnam, Bangladesh. But that's another story. But people started moving there partially because of factories, but also as people began to move there, you're also getting this element of people moving down there because the weather was better, and that would kind of increase their own demand. It was warmer. Now, I might say, well, I've been to Alabama. It's extremely hot. Well, air conditioning became much more widespread in the late 60s, early 70s. And it's one of those things I can't exaggerate enough what a big deal air conditioning was. And so you have all these people moving south. So you see this big change for the big population centers in the north, gradually losing, for example, seats in the House and the Senate and the Electoral College, and they moved, not the Senate, I'm sorry, seats in the House and the Electoral College and moving south. New York, when I was a kid, was the most popular state in the Union. And now what is it, number 4? The southern states. Same thing with California. And the other big demographic change would be after the Immigration Act of 1965. This allowed for something that was already happening because it was still technically legal, but a significant number of immigrants from other parts of the world came in. So you're seeing an increased population in Hispanic population and also Asian Americans. But that's part of the reason why the Republican Party and the Southern strategy turned out to be brilliant. Because if you're doing a Southern strategy and those populations are rising, that's brilliant politics. The goals, that might be another story. Next, W.B. Du Bois. I thought too I mentioned this one before. So Du Bois would he'd be one of the, not necessarily the founder, but one of the most important proponents of the NAACP group I have talked about in class, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Don't worry, just know it's a civil rights group, and put down the NAACP. If you put that on the test, if you need that, that's perfect. But they went, they looked at Booker T. Washington and said, no, that's wrong. They have to demand equality. They have to end Jim Crow laws. They have to get rid of the voting restrictions. They have to get rid of restrictions on where African Americans can live. The only way they're going to have true economic, social, and political freedom is to get rid of those laws. So they demanded equality. And so Du Bois would not be as popular amongst white progressives, and certainly hated by white conservatives in the South. Both, and remember, that was only Democrats then. Next one down. Okay, the Filipino Insurrection. I need a drink. Oh, we're still on page 7. Very good. So the Filipino insurrection, did I skip one? I'll come back to it. That was after the United States got the Philippines on the Treaty of Paris of 1898. Remember, the United States paid for that after the Spanish-American War. The Filipinos revolted because they wanted independence. And this would be a bloody, horrible, brutal war where the United States would use many of the same tactics it accused Imperial Spain of using, including concentration camps, reconcentration policy, remember that from Spain. They used many of the same brutal tactics, and at least 50,000 Filipino guerrillas and over 200,000 Filipino civilians would die. Over about 20,000 Americans would be killed or wounded. And this horrible, bloody insurrection that would cure the United States under Governor General William Howard Taft would finally come up with an agreement with the Filipinos and say, we'll give you your independence in 46. And the United States would abandon colonial imperialism. But remember, it would stick with economic imperialism. Next one down, My Lai, and I know I've talked about this before, but I'll mention it very quickly. This was the worst example. My Lai's on page 11, about halfway down on the left. And there would be over 150 instances of U.S. war crimes in the Vietnam War that would actually go to trial. But this was the most infamous, where anywhere from 200 to 300 Vietnamese civilians were massacred by U.S. soldiers, partially after what happened to the Tet Offensive, but someone in a unit was killed, and Lieutenant William Calley, the commander of this company, would be blamed for giving the order, even though he would claim he got the order from his regimental commander and on up. The Army covered this up. My guess is he probably did get the command, but this is the American Division. It was a disastrous division of the U.S. Army, the worst in the Army. In fact, they got rid of this division after the Vietnam War. But eventually, when it became public, Calley would be court-martialed. But this would become a big issue in the pro-war, anti-war. The pro-war Hawks versus the anti-war Doves. And the anti-war Doves were like, this is what happens when we put young men in these horrible situations. The Hawks, this is the way war is, and those were probably guerrillas. And in fact, Nixon, to appeal to the Hawks, would pardon Calley. Next one down. Tea Party. And by the way, I have already said Nixon to China today, so I'm not going to say that one again. So the Tea Party might be the last culminating or last big thing that happened for the American Revolutionary War. Remember, that started with the British debt, trying to enforce mercantilism. But the Tea Party came out of the Tea Act in 1773, where the British tried one more time to cutting the tax on tea, but collecting it through a monopoly of the East India Company. And this would trigger massive protests in Boston, including storming ships and dumping the tea out into the harbor, the Tea Party. And the biggest reason for the Tea Party was not the tax. It was that they were giving a monopoly to the East India Company, and that implied that the British could control their entire economy. When people say the Tea Party was against taxes, no, they don't understand. It's the monopoly. It's the control. And that would lead to the coercive acts, which the British would use to punish the colonies, most famously abolishing the Massachusetts government and closing the Boston harbor. And and quartering troops there. This infuriated the patriots, who said, see what happens. The British are trying to destroy us, and look what they did. They destroyed us. And so that would directly lead to the Continental Congress.
Partridge, I think they meant the Tea Party on page 12.
Ah! Well, I've answered the Tea Party already on page 4. I know you want to know that, right? So let's go to page 12. Okay, I got ahead of myself. The Tea Party was formed. It's basically a subset of the Republican Party, especially. It would basically go away. But the Tea Party, they tried to use the imagery of the one I just mentioned, but this was an anti-tax party. But the big thing was it was a protest against President Obama's plan to try to have a stimulus bill to help people who had their mortgages, they couldn't pay back their mortgages due to the housing crash that led to the big panic of the big panic of 2008, the Great Recession. And so they were protesting President Obama's plan to help mortgage owners, but also the plan to reform health insurance called the Affordable Care Act, or it's what we call Obamacare. And this basically turned into an arm of the Republican Party that was quite effective and trying to attack President Obama's plans, and it worked. President Obama in 2012 basically allowed for all his plans to be cut, and austerity started. Let's go back up to Stokely Carmichael now, on page 11. Thank you for saying the Tea Party. By the way, it's nearly 8. Do you want me to keep going? I'll finish up the ones on the list. If anybody's just desperate to have one more, I'll have it. But I did also say, if you come in at lunch and want a little bit of like a security blanket to ask a couple questions, I'll be glad to do it. Maybe. I needed water. Stokely Carmichael, page 11. And Stokely Carmichael would be the leader of a movement called Black Power. And they wanted more direct action for equal rights. As they saw it, civil disobedience was moving too slow, and the white leadership of the United States government and Congress was just giving little crumbs. And so they're going to demand direct action. And their big movement was this idea that all blacks working together is the only way we can get past this. And one of the most important elements about this, about black power, was to go against this idea that black was somehow negative. Remember we talked about in racism, I told you about how, white became civilized, and in the light was more noble and more advanced, while black was savage and dark and sinister. That's what the villain dressed. And the Black Power movement said, no, black is beautiful. There's nothing wrong with being black. Black is positive. It is not a negative thing. Blacks to get recognition, blacks are not to somehow act like whites. And this was a powerful idea that really led to a big backlash, part of the conservative backlash. Because a lot of people said, well, Stokely Carmichael must hate America. No, he was fighting for an America where, regardless of color, everyone is treated equally economically and politically. And this would eventually lead to a severe backlash, and the biggest gun control laws ever passed in the United States would be signed by Governor Ronald Reagan to take guns out of the hands of members of the Black Power movement who started a group called the Black Panthers. Stokely Carmichael's a pretty amazing guy. Next, I think I've mentioned Nicaragua once before, but I'll say it very quickly on page 12. There's a civil war in Nicaragua, and the horrible American-supported dictatorship called the Somoza dictatorship was overthrown and replaced with what's called the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas were socialists. And immediately, when Ronald Reagan became president, they said the Democrats have allowed the communists to get right there in Nicaragua, and soon they'll use that as a jumping off point to invade the United States. I'm not making that up. Nicaragua will invade the United States. And Reagan threatened to use, there was even talk about using American troops, and people thought this would be another Vietnam. Congress would pass a law to keep weapons out of the hands of those fighting the Sandinistas. They would be called the Contras. And you notice it says Iran-Contra there. And Iran-Contra, this was a pretty cutthroat organization involved with a bunch of mass murders in Nicaragua and El Salvador. But Reagan violated the law, and they secretly sent weapons to the Contras and to Iran. And this would be a massive scandal that 20 people would be indicted. Some would be jailed. Most would be pardoned by President Bush. Reagan somehow got off, partially because he was beginning first stage Alzheimer's. Iran-Contra would come out publicly in 86. Nicaragua, 81, 82, 83. Next, the Nativists know-nothings. Since we have, I'll do the Nativists know-nothing. Where's Nativists know-nothing? Okay, that's right next to Irish immigration. And so that's on page 5, about a third of the way down. And the nativists were anti-immigrant. And they feared that the new immigrants were not, this was like a cultural argument that they're not like real Americans because they came from Ireland or southern Germany. It was also intensely anti-Catholic, that they'll be more loyal to the Pope. And it was fearful that they would take their jobs or lower wages. And immigrants do. They can, in an isolated area, they can drop wages, but in the long run, they always increase the size of the market and increase wages. But that's another story, at least historically. So this nativist movement would be strong. And eventually they would form their own third party called the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party. And this was a blatantly anti-immigrant party. And in 1856, it looked like they might become the party to replace the Whigs. They ran former President Millard Fillmore and did very well in the election. There were northern and southern know-nothings. Most of the northern know-nothings, nativists, were rolled into the Republican Party. Southern ones became Democrats because after the Civil War, there's only going to be Democrats until the Southern strategy. The Pentagon Papers, that was a secret history of the Vietnam War. That is on page 11. I feel like I mentioned this one before. It's one of the things when I do things a lot, and Pentagon Papers halfway down, and Daniel Ellsberg would secretly release the secret history of the Vietnam War. Now, the history was actually 45 to 68, but it told all of the it laid out many of the lies that the Pentagon had kept secret and the U.S. government kept secret during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administration, especially the fact that there was not an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, even though that would be used as a resolution, a blank check to go to war. By the way, I just told you what the Gulf of Tonkin was. Johnson lied about a North Vietnamese attack on U.S. ships, and he would use that as to get a resolution for a blank check. The reason Johnson got the Tonkin Gulf resolution was to show that he's tough on communism. But that would be then the justification to go to war. Back down to the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg would release this, infuriating Nixon. They would arrest him. But this seemed to give credence to the anti-war movement and made a paranoid Nixon worry about leaks, and that would lead directly to Watergate. Okay, I've already said Nixon to China. So Tea Party, Earth Day. So Earth Day would be, and it really had its roots out of the Silent Spring, but also the first, an incredible law of the Great Society, the Clean Water Act. I can't begin to tell you what a big deal the Clean Water Act was. When a river in river in Cleveland, Ohio caught fire 4 different times because of all the pollutants. A river caught fire. Well, out of this and Silent Spring and the first kind of bips of environmental laws, Democrats, well, not Democrats, I'm sorry, nationwide, this first new, and they would dub themselves environmental movement, would have their first big day to recognize all the massive, unregulated pollution that was still going on all across the world in 1970, and to raise awareness in the first Earth Day. And you could see a direct line from that first Earth Day would convince Democrats who have the majority in Congress to pass the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, which would regulate, at least do somewhat the regulation of the environment for the United States. It was weak. Nixon was opposed to it, but he had no choice. He signed the EPA, even though it was weakened. And so this would be the first major effort to enforce environmental laws. And if you would have seen how dirty rivers were, heck, Lake Michigan had a foot thick of foam over the southern half, a foot thick. There were no fish in Lake Michigan. And now that's gone. And the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland is now only just kind of disgusting, but it doesn't catch fire. And this would be the first major environmental law. But I should add, this is a massive regulation, and this goes completely against trickle-down economics. So the EPA was probably at its height during the Carter administration. The Reagan administration, as part of Reaganomics, would dramatically cut the EPA, and it's been cut down to virtually nothing during the Trump administration, for example, and we'll see. So this is one of the big regulations that Reaganomics did. Last call. Are there any others before I go? Any others? Are we good? Last effort. So I made this mistake and I left it in there and I totally forgot. It's supposed to be Occupy Wall Street. I guess I was temporarily dyslexic there. Occupy Wall. But this was a massive protest on Wall Street to protest the massive inequalities of wealth that seemed to accelerate after the Great Recession. And so we have these two, so this is like the opposite of that, who wanted like to do something about healthcare. One of the big ones were the massive student debt crisis that is ballooning as we speak. And even though they would be broken up by, in the city of New York, by really brutal tactics by the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, well, not he's ordered the police to do it. This would also set the stage so we have the two kind of opposite ways. And so as we still have the Tea Party, so conservative economics is still pretty dominant, but this would be beginning to return back to a more Keynesian and left economics. And that's where we're kind of at right now. So a lot of influence down the road. You know, it's impossible to imagine in 2016 an absolutely unknown candidate like, completely, totally unknown, like Bernie Sanders, all of a sudden almost winning the Democratic nomination, and if not for COVID, might have won it in 2020, if not for Occupy Wall Street. Wall Street, I know. Are we good? I'm pretty tired. Do you want any more? I will answer any questions on at lunch, but covered a lot here. Wow, did we cover a lot? Are we good? No ones that you're absolutely panicking about? I'll take that as a no. All right, I will record this. I hope you we got a lot out of this. Don't forget, I will check it really fast tomorrow while you do your practice test. If you got most of it done, I'll give you full credit. You know, if I look back and you got 8 pages not done, don't expect full credit when you turn it in on Monday. But please use this. If you check on my Teams for today, just give me a sec. If you check on my Teams for today, I posted a few things on there, including a Far Side cartoon, but there's a practice test, which we'll do in class tomorrow, review sheet, all this kind of information. Please go and take a look at that stuff to review. If you have any questions about the test, ask me, but remember, yes, 50 push-ups a day, we're on it. All right, you have no idea how many bar hangs we're gonna do. You guys are gonna be hanging for an hour. Well, we'll be throwing like medicine balls at your belly. Okay, on that note, I will see you. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Mr. Partridge.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Goodbye.